The fifth contemplation with regard to action and results of our actions. For most of us, I think it does quite understandably generate a certain amount of intellectual uncertainty or wondering, or can it really be like this, or what does exactly that mean? And that's, I think, natural. It's something kind of different than what most of us have been kind of schooled in culturally and socially as to the basis of ethicality. And so just to reflect a little on what it means that my actions are my true possessions. So there's something about what we understand in the Buddha's teachings as the development and cultivation of the wholesome potential of the human heart and mind. And we can understand in this that every action has the effect of deepening, of strengthening, of reinforcing whatever it is that moved that action. So whether it be an action of speech, of body, or even of mind, and in this a mental intention is regarded as an action. Just the thinking, I'll do this. Even if we don't actually do it, it still has a certain weightiness to it. And essentially the recognition that so far as we act from craving, from greed, from selfishness, from harshness, unkindness, cruelty, that the tendency towards that kind of action, not only is it actually painful to us, because it dishonors and disregards the truth of our connection by tending to, and reinforces a sense of a separate, isolated, disconnected self that we feel to be needing to advance the interests of and not concerned for the interests of others. That's the effect of these particular patterns. Not only does it do that, but it actually reinforces that propensity. There's a kind of way in which it becomes harder to break free of it by repetition of it. And this we understand is in the way habits are formed. And that by consciously refraining from acting on such things, by consciously cultivating the actions that are born out of generosity, out of kindness, that respect our connection, that honor the truth of our interdependence, we actually align with a possibility that despite the uncontrollable and complex conditionality, uncontrollable nature of our experience and the complex conditionality of how it comes to be formed, that nonetheless we can influence it in a positive direction without that determining the outcome. That's a very sort of big difference between the two. We can, but that in terms of the inner condition, there's a very clear movement and trajectory that we align ourselves with. Does that make sense? Is there anyone for whom that's, what's he talking about? So that's at the sort of, as I think I said, it's at the heart of, and one of the primary bases for why make the effort to be wakeful. So I can see more clearly where I'm coming from and whether I want to act in those ways or hold back for it, because it's also about what we don't do. What we don't do that maybe we would have benefited from or would have been useful to. And equally what we don't do that we're glad we didn't do. Refraining from things that may be harmful. And the contemplating, reflecting on the effect of regret, remorse, of what it's like for us when we fail to do that. And I talked about moral injury, this kind of curious and relatively recent concept that there's something in us that's harmed by not doing things that could be helpful, which we could have done, or by doing things which are harmful, which we could have refrained from doing. And I'm qualifying it by that sense of could have, because some things we can't help but do. In order to exist, one has to consume living material, which inevitably involves taking the life of other living things. And even if one is a vegetarian or a vegan, the production of the foods that one would eat still will involve the loss of life of other creatures who would have liked to eat it too, or even just in the soil where it grew. There's no way around that, apart from not feeding this one, in which case a living being is also going to be harmed because this one would die. So we're in a world which by our existence we cannot help but have impact that will be experienced as harmful. That's just one example of that. Probably none of us can get here without having even just coming to a day where we're hopefully cultivating something wholesome, learning something beneficial. We will probably, all of us, and certainly I, will have done things which will have impacted on others, other beings, other living things. Even in the walking meditation, there was a moment where I was close to standing on a bumblebee. I'm glad I saw it before I did, but it was just sitting there. It wasn't moving. It was half under a blade of grass. But most of the time, if that happens, I wouldn't have known about it, wearing my big fat shoes. And just, it's, I think, useful to contemplate, to go, oh, of course. Not in a self-judging or self-blaming way, but, okay. So I'm really glad I was paying attention, just in that simple way. I'm really glad that that step, not all of them, I can assure you, not all of them, but that step I was really attending to where my foot was going, and I didn't put it on the bumblebee. I have to assume that sometimes I've put it on a small creature without knowing it. Small examples, but not small in one sense. So there's, in a sense, what we could talk about moral injury. We could also talk about moral health. I'm not sure moral is quite the right word, but it's the word in this term. Moral health. It's like, oh, if I can be injured, I can also be uninjured. Or if I can be ill, I can also be healthy. And I think moral health is is another way we could think about those concepts we were talking about in terms of regret and remorse, or the absence of them. In moments where one has the space to consider it, I think we all probably imagine, how will I feel about doing this thing? Or having not done this thing? Or holding back from doing this thing? Whatever our decision is. As a basis for deciding, for making that choice. And it's like to refrain from doing what is harmful, that one can refrain from, because I understand I'll regret doing it. If it was something I could have avoided doing. If it's something I couldn't avoid doing, it's different. I can still feel sad about it. I can't avoid being gendered as a man. That's how it is for me. And each of us, whatever way we feel ourselves gendered, we don't get to decide it. It's just, that's where we are. But as someone who is gendered, as a male, and in this case a cisgender, male, I'm part of a patriarchal system and I have an advantage from it and a benefit out of it that I can't undo or avoid being in certain ways complicit in. And yet, in recognizing that, there's a responsibility that is, okay, so what can you do to try and make a difference here? What can you do to try and make a difference here? I can't help but be part of it, because that's just how it seems I turned up. Turning up in a culture or a society where most of us, in comparison to some worlds and societies, we have privilege. Different levels of privilege. Some of us will recognize we have considerable privilege. And as a white, male, cisgender person who, or at least passes for white, I have immense privilege. What we're moved and called to do, where we have the capacity to do things, we feel remorse where we failed to do what we could. We also sometimes feel remorse from having done what we could have not done, if you follow. It's not just action, it's also holding back from action. And so this is just something to contemplate, just to see, oh, when I make this choice, to give oneself that opportunity to consider. We talked about young people. It's raised as so young people. I mean, properly young people, not just sort of people who are younger than me, because you can be younger than me and still not be that young a person. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but anyway, it happened that was the case. But I remember as a child, I was really unkind to my little sister sometimes. It's really sad for me to contemplate that. It's like, oh, I can totally see why that was the case. I can understand it, so I don't judge or sort of criticize myself unduly. But if I think about it, it's like, oh, I'm really sad that was so. And I'm glad that I had opportunity to say to her before she, not just before she died, in fact, but as adults, say, oh, I'm sorry I wasn't always a good brother to you. You know? Such things, small things, but not small things. At a personal level, at a collective level, as a society, we have collective cultural karma. I think I mentioned what our society does. We individually have a degree of karma involved and responsibility involved in that. Even if we ourselves can't make our society somehow become more fair, more just, address issues of social justice in the ways we might wish we could, there's something about also just acknowledging, I would wish for that. And where can I do something? Where can I contribute to a more equitable distribution of resources? To a protection or caring for those who might be subject to some form of oppression or disempowerment. Where can I do something? Finding a way. Because where I could have done something, if I don't, I will regret that. In a certain way, it's quite selfish, it seems like. But it's enlightened selfishness of understanding, oh, actually, to care for this one, I need to care for something larger. Sometimes I need to give my emphasis to just looking after this one, of course, or the ones close to me, but sometimes I need to give it in a wider radius. And so we might find ourselves called to work towards changing the actions of our community, of our society, of our nations, or of our peoples, or of our particular gender community. In this case, with those gendered as masculine, within a patriarchal structure. That would make sense. That would be wise. That would be compassionate. And that would actually, in terms of karma, be wholesome. Sometimes just letting oneself feel the distress of not knowing what to do that might help, or feeling unable to do what might help. Actually letting oneself feel it, not in a judging or blaming way, but just, oh, this hurts. It hurts that I can read about people in danger and not protect them. People subject to violence and not be able to prevent it from taking place. It hurts. I think there's something profoundly important about letting oneself feel that. Doing what we can when we can do something, but not staying distant from it because we can't. And at the same time, letting oneself feel and do and honour where we can and what we have done that makes a difference. So that we don't just orient towards where we've failed, because we'll have all failed in many ways to do something or to hold back from doing something. When we look at it and think, I rather wish I did it the other way. We'll have all done that. But we'll have also, all of us, done something that maybe wasn't the easiest choice, but was the right one, the good one, the wholesome one that made something a little better or less bad than it would have been otherwise. And so this territory, I think it's useful just again to contemplate. And I had considered having another exercise, but I think we've done lots of good work here, and I don't want to overload the process for anyone at all. But the question that I was considering inviting was to just reflect on, okay, and so you don't have to do this, but I'm just going to name it. Just let yourself hear how it is. Okay, so tell me something that you've done or failed to do which saddens your heart. It's just like, oh, yeah, we've done this. You don't have to tell me something, but it's almost like, oh, what are these things? But then equally, tell me something you've done or refrained from doing which gladdens your heart. And it's like we're very finely tuned instruments. If we're close with ourselves, we know what those things are. And when we're distracted or disconnected or reactive or young and don't know what the heck's going on, we're just, in a way, small, intelligent or somewhat intelligent animals. It's like, oh, we don't yet have those sensitivities unless we're supported in them. It's so important to acknowledge what gladdens our hearts. Not just in terms of what's not to do with me, like a tree gladdens my heart. But if I plant a tree, that really gladdens my heart. It's different. And you might find it useful to consider which way your tendency or attention is to lean. It's an invitation. If you tend to lean towards the remembering all the things where I kind of didn't do so good a job of, or didn't do so well at, it's probably going to be helpful for you to give some time to contemplating where you did actually. To remember, oh, okay, yeah. And if what you most remember is all the things you think, oh, I did really good at that, that was great, It's not the tendency in our culture, I have to say, for it to lean that way. But for some of us, we might. That, I just remember all the things that I'm really proud of and don't think I did anything that I regret. Now, you may be a remarkable human being if that's so. It could well be. I'll be happy if it's true. But it might be that it's useful to consider and reflect on the other side of that. We are the owners of our actions. Insofar as one aspect of them is written into our heart and mind. Like a groove that's deepened by every time we pass along that pathway. Whether wholesome or unwholesome roots. This is so. Our society is formed by a collective activity of similar pathway forming through passing, through travelling these pathways, individually and collectively. So even if we feel like we're not making a big difference by choosing to say no to something we see unhelpful in how our society functions, or choosing to engage in something that isn't what's normally done because we see that actually this could be helpful, we actually begin to change, not just ourselves, but our world. Even if it means that we just accelerate towards disaster slightly more slowly. If we were to be considering something as seriously concerning as the state of our climate and ecology at this time. And it's not that we necessarily get to stop what's happening, but we might, by our own contribution, contribute to it happening just a little bit more slowly, and maybe that might give time for more people to be able to adjust, to handle it, or even to make a difference in a greater way. By speaking up for people or communities whose voice is not heard, who are subject to violence or oppression. Even if it appears that some, or the people who need to listen aren't listening, by doing so, nonetheless, we make a difference. We make a difference. And so we have the possibility to shape the world into which we are born again and again and again. In this very life, we are born again and again and again into the next moment, which in some ways is a new world. And the invitation of Dharma teachings and practices to offer ourselves to that possibility.